Chapter 20. Awakening. Isaiah awoke to the smell of bacon frying. His eyes opened and he sat back. He had fallen asleep with his arms folded under his head on the diner's countertop. Behind the bar, the old woman glanced back from the stovetop to smile at him. "Your breakfast near ready, honey. Cooked it up special for you." Isaiah rubbed his eyes and arched his back, stretching his chest and arms. The bacon did smell good. The fat man beside him smiled at Isaiah. "You had yourself a hell of a bad dream there, didn't you? Whew! The way you were chattering, I figured you was about to start talking in tongues." "Welcome back." Isaiah nodded. "Yeah, bad dreams for sure." The old woman pulled 4 strips of blackened bacon off the stove and plated it beside a stack of pancakes. She smothered the pancakes in butter and maple syrup, then garnished it all with an arrangement of bright red strawberries before setting it on Isaiah's placemat. "There you go. Dig on in, child. Let me get you some hot coffee to wash it all down with. You take cream?" "When I can get it." "Sugar?" "No, ma'am." She took his coffee cup and went for the kettle. Isaiah picked up his knife and fork and cut into the stack of pancakes. The front screen door creaked open. Isaiah looked back. His Aunt Jean was standing in the doorframe. The old woman turned from the stove with Isaiah's coffee and caught sight of Jean. "Uh-oh," said the fat man. He opened his Henry Ford hate tract and started back to reading. "Ha! Well, looky who's here," said the old woman. "Come on in, Miss Jean." Jean ignored the invitation. "Isaiah, you got to come with me." The old woman placed Isaiah's coffee before him. "Woman, he got to do no such thing. He ain't even touched his breakfast." Jean saw the plate in front of Isaiah. She sort of glared at the old woman, then looked to her nephew. "Isaiah, put that plate aside and walk with me right now." She stretched out her hand toward him. "Your papa's dead, and I need a word with you." At the thought of his father, gone from the earth, Isaiah's fork dropped from his hand. It felt like a nearly inaudible hum was rumbling through the room as the loss hit him. "How?" was all that he could get out. "Come with me, Isaiah, and I'll tell you all about it." Isaiah stood and made for the door. The fat man shrugged and muttered something to himself. "You're heading for nothing but heartbreak and agony, boy," said the old woman. Isaiah looked back at her. It seemed like heartbreak and agony and the strength of will to face down both were his only inheritance. "I ain't your boy," he said. He took Jean's hand and she led him out the door, and suddenly the front porch was not a diner in the desert. It was the porch from his home in Mississippi. He blinked, and it was not midday sun. It was nighttime, verging toward the dawn. Jean led him to the steps and sat, guiding him down beside her. "What's going on, Auntie?" Isaiah asked. "Trouble, son. Trouble for sure." "Where's Papa?" "Them devils come for him night before last. They come for us all. But your Papa stood firm. He held them back. Silas and little sis and your mama all got free and clear. They safe for now, far as I can tell." Isaiah's tears flowed. Jean wrapped her arms around him and drew him to her. He buried his head in her shoulder and cried. "It's all right, Zaya. It's all right, honey. Your papa's gone, but he gave himself up for his babies. He even gave himself up for you last night." Isaiah saw it then. The blue devils coming for him, his end coming with them. Then Isaiah saw it all through the lion's eyes. It smashed into the demons, rending and biting blue-stained flesh. The lion saw Isaiah turn and run. It finished its last kill and exploded after Isaiah, on his heels, running behind him, guiding him with his pursuit until they were racing toward Renoir's underground bunker. He saw the lion reach out with his forepaw and trip his son, sending him on a tumble to a dead stop on the trap door that led to the only sanctuary anywhere to be had. The lion stopped and stood over Isaiah, breath heaving in and out. It sniffed at Isaiah and nudged him, making sure he still lived. Satisfied, he stepped back. He looked down at the stain of blood from the picked stab into his chest and licked at the wound. The blood was quickly spreading out through his fur, a certain bad omen. But the lion sat patiently. After a time, Isaiah began to move. The lion stood. He sniffed at his son one last time, then eased away silently, limping into the woods, disappearing into the trees to find his end. Isaiah sat back from Jean's shoulder and wiped his tears away. "Oh, Lord. Oh, Lord. Listen to me, Isaiah. You asleep right now. You dreaming. I need you to wake up. You don't wake up right now, you ain't ever going to. You understand me? You can't let your papa's sacrifice be all for nothing." Isaiah understood. "Yes, ma'am." Isaiah woke to the shock of instant choking. His hands were roped in behind him, the hempen rope encircling his neck, which had already been cinched taut, anacondaed even tighter. He heard his neck bones pop like cracking knuckles as they hauled him up to sitting. He scrambled his boots on the wooden floor of the barn and was able to half stand and take his weight for a second. Then there was a huge yanking, and he was pulled to his tiptoes. Another yank, then his toes were scrambling, a half-inch off the floor, desperate for purchase that he was lifting away from. Then he was pure fighting gravity, gagging toward his death. When the naked man and his pals tied Isaiah off, his boots were 2 feet off the ground. They stood back and let him dangle until he passed out. 30 seconds went by. Then, with a nod from the naked man, they shoved a creaky wooden chair under his feet and slackened the rope. They held him up, while one of the little clan splashed a bucketful of water into Isaiah's face. He came to, sucking air and coughing water out through an almost cracked windpipe. The naked man caressed Isaiah's scarred face. He glanced at the barn's doors where the dawn could be seen coming. He nodded to his helpers, and the rope was gently pulled taut until Isaiah's boots were barely on the chair. "Bear this in mind," said the naked man. "I have it on good authority that they got your brother and mama and little sis last night, your pappy the night before, your sweet Aunt Jean along with him." He patted Isaiah's face. "Till we meet again, boy. You try holding on to all that anger until then." Then the sun rose, and Isaiah watched his tormentors tumble to the barn floor, piles of cold meat and bones. "Come and see," it had said, and then it had whispered his brother's story to him. 2.5 years after Alexander Renoir sniped Sebastian Strothmann in the woods. Tied to a tree alongside Jonah Unger and Adolf Hitler, Wolfgang Strothmann was given the opportunity to witness his brother's death. The demon leaned in close and shared Sebastian's entire journey from Liège and Léonie up to his violent end in Leuven. Wolfgang might as well have been there, standing witness as Alexander Renoir put the rifle to his cheek, sighted with care, then squeezed the trigger. Wolfgang cried out and pulled against the rope that held him to the tree, but all it did was cut his wrists and scrape his forearms against the rough bark. The images poured in, unwanted and desperately desired. Wolfgang had no idea if the story was true, but the pictures in his mind's eye became instantly fixed there, seared into him. When it finished speaking, Wolfgang was shaking, tears soaking his cotton blindfold. The demon who had been in his ear stopped and sat back, laughing softly to itself. "Yes, Wolfgang, I am so very sorry to be the bearer of such bad news. My thoughts and prayers are with you and your family in this time of mourning and rage." It sat back and laughed loud. It patted his shoulder. "Try to get some rest, Wolfgang. You will need your strength and wits for the road ahead." Then it gently fell in a heap. The sun had risen. Guinan stared down at Halstead, splayed out, Vitruvian style, terrified and in pain. Guinan held a stone in his hands, the size of a large, ripe gourd. He looked east, where dawn was approaching fast, and he wept. Guinan remembered it all. He remembered them, rushing his village and killing his grandfather. He remembered them tackling and overwhelming him with their strength and their numbers, then carrying him off, beaten and bound. Guinan remembered his sister crying for him to help her through the darkness. The rage that had burned all night inside him was a flame in his chest that burst to ignition and raced wildfire through his whole being. He screamed, and it erupted from Harry Moss's throat, a monstrous animal cry through the ruined trachea. He turned that rage toward the man laid out before him. He raised the stone above his head and screamed out again. The sun's first rays broke the plane of the horizon. Guinan lost his grip on the stone. It fell awkwardly toward Halstead. Instead of caving in his face, it struck a glancing blow, knocking him senseless, leaving a bloody, purpling patch of skin on his temple. Guinan had a flitting moment of realization that he was leaving. Then he lost his connection. Harry Moss's dead eyes rolled back to bloodshot whites, and he collapsed, crashing on top of Halstead. He lay there, a dead weight, his dead eyes inches from Halstead's own. Caitlin O'Leary awoke to the sound of teeth clattering. They were her own mandibles, shaking from the cold, bouncing her canines and molars off each other. She pressed her teeth together, and the vibration drew back through her neck into her shoulder muscles. Her entire body was shaking and quivering now, absent of mind. The earthly vessel's last-ditch effort to push hot blood to her extremities before hypothermia took hold and ended things badly. She had been told that freezing to death was ultimately a pleasant sensation. The brain would release the suffering at some point and cease to feel pain. False warmth would spread through her. The void would take her with mercy. That did not seem to be the case. She rolled onto her stomach and used numb hands to push up to her knees. Her body strained into submission, joints and cold muscles shrieking and aching, back locked into a twisted hunch in self-defense, trying to keep her organs tepidly warm so they would not fail. Supreme effort got one half-dead foot under her, and she stumbled up to swaying feet. She hugged herself tight and stamped blood toward extremities she could not feel. She glanced down at them. So strange to look at body parts that ought to be yours, but have disconnected themselves. She understood her past paraplegic patients better now. Isaiah's shotgun was on the grass. The blued steel had sprays of frost playing over it. Caitlin's knees creaked as she bent down and surveyed the thing. It was more proof that this was all reality. She picked it up in clumsy, frozen hands. An awkward thrust of her arm slung it over her neck and shoulder. When she looked up and saw her, she froze. The Mastiff stared at her with chestnut eyes that shone out of a black face and a tiger-striped brindle coat. The big dog sniffed at the breeze, catching what she could of the woman's scent. She eased off her haunches and made her way toward Caitlin, hesitant, still testing the currents of invisible air for danger, learning everything she could about this woman from her smells. The adrenaline in her sweat, its odor sickly sweet. The cold blood of the Red Maiden's vessel that had blown back on her from the shotgun blasts, its taste something rancid and dead. The gunpowder residue on her hands that named her as the cause of the Red Maiden's disintegration, its flavor that of poisonous sulfur and burnt metal. She closed the gap and sniffed at Caitlin's trembling hand. She used her muzzle to push at Caitlin's fingers, looking for treats. Nothing there but the fingers. The big dog let out a little huff of steam that seemed a sigh. Her mouth opened, and a big tongue, parapeted with sharp white teeth, came out and gave a gentle lick to the back of Caitlin's hand. She turned and headed toward the woods. When she reached the clearing, she looked back to see what the woman was going to do. Caitlin took a step, following on frozen feet. The big brindle dog turned and led the way into the woods. Francois had remained stock still in the church tower for nearly an hour. The man below, who called himself Adam, spoke the entire time and told their story. He knew every detail, details that only Adam could have known, thoughts and secrets he had never shared with Francois. They all rang true. It took every ounce of self-control that Francois had not to open the trapdoor and leap down to his embrace. But he knew it could not be Adam. Whatever was below was like some massive Senegalese golden orb spider, trying to coax Francois down into its web, where every effort to escape would only pull him deeper into its trap, winding him head to toe in its silken steel, sinking its fangs through his chest and sucking out every morsel of life that was in him. As dawn came, Adam stopped talking. Francois heard a crash beneath him as the body turfed onto the landing. He heard the oddly syncopated clatter of a steel helmet bouncing and rolling down the stairs until it echoed away, spinning to a stop 2 flights below. The cold yellow sunlight struck the steeple and breached the tower windows, playing gently over Francois's scarred face. He set his cutlass aside, put his face in his hands, and wept like a child for the first time in as long as he could remember. When he had spent all he had in him, he picked up his cutlass and stood. He stared at the trapdoor for a moment, not wanting to see what lay below, but knowing there was only one decision to make. He grabbed the iron loop and pulled it open, letting it crash back on its hinges. It was not an arachnid monster with a man's voice. The man, framed below him in the trapdoor's opening, was not Adam. He was a German, if the uniform was to tell the tale. Young Matthias Nielsen by name. The German boy who had failed to burn the church and suffered execution at his comrades' hands. But Francois did not know that. All he could see was damp, field-grey wool, 5 bullet wounds and a tight grouping on the chest that told of the dawn execution, and matted blood in coarse auburn hair. That was enough to know that this was not his Adam. Adam's hair had been short and bright blonde, his eyes hazel green with fiery copper rings around the irises, like the sun eclipsed by the round blackening of the moon. Francois lowered the ladder and descended. Standing over the body, he felt tears coming again, but he warded them off. He'd known that the voice did not belong to Adam, but the thoughts and words and memories had. It had taken a terror-fed self-control, but Francois knew for certain had he swung the trapdoor wide and dropped into his lover's embrace, the bloody bayonet in Matthias Nielsen's left hand would have ended up deep in his guts. Francois took a moment with Matthias's corpse. Then the big man jogged down the steps, trying to leave that past behind him. At the bottom landing he paused, thinking he had heard a noise from above. He stood there for long seconds, silent, listening. But if there had been a sound outside of his imagination, it did not reoccur. He moved through the empty chapel and jogged for the beams that streamed through the open front doors, eager for the sanctuary of the sun's light.